and what do I have that might be able to accomplish that? Because I don't know about the rest of you, but my wallet is not bursting out of my back pocket here or anything with money or anything, and so we got lots of other things we need to spend that money on too, and so. But you need to get done what you need to get done, and so figuring out the best way to do that um, is just using your creativity and thinking through what you're actually needing to do. And that's what we're trying to talk about here with this presentation is what I want to try to do is get these fundamental principles settled in your mind. And because I've talked to people here, and every time I go to presentation stuff, I talk to people and they're doing all kinds of different things. And some things are working pretty well for them. And I don't squash anybody's ideas and everything like that. If they're accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, now it's no guarantee that it's going to endure for an extended period of time. And my goal is I want to be able to do this year in and year out, and I want it to be getting better every single year, which is what it'll do if you're following the principles. So if you can get settled in your mind these basic principles of how to look at it and how to approach it, then you're not necessarily going to do everything the way that I would do it. And I'm not your boss anyway. So it won't offend me or hurt my feelings if you do something slightly different. It's going to work. Like, for example, there's a school of thought out there of using rock powders. The individual I was talking to this morning was using rock powders and everything, like granite dust and green sand, which has got potassium and iron in it, and it's got exchange capacity to it. Limestones are rock dust for putting on, rock phosphate, all of these mineral materials that you can grind up and you can put on your soil. And if you have good biology, now you're not going to necessarily achieve everything you could achieve by completely, more specifically balancing the soil. But remember I said the bar is really low? You're going to get stuff for sure better than what you have available to you in general. And so anything going the right direction, God works with us this way. I guarantee you that God has given us instruction and we're not listening to half of it. And God's not stopping. God's not saying, well, if you're not going to listen, are there any of you parents in here? Have you ever had children that didn't do what you instructed them to do? That's God helping us to understand his position. Just be thankful you don't have 8 billion children that are not listening. But I don't even remember why I brought that up. Anyway.
Listening to your methods of gardening.
Yeah. So understanding what it is you're trying to accomplish. It's not for me to say to you that you can't do that. Remember, somebody brought up the Back to Eden method, and I know people that work great for. Is it everything that they could do? No, but it's definitely, there's a principle, and we're going to see those in just a minute here, that it was addressing. And so these principles are what you want to consider, and you need to consider your conditions. Will it work? Will this be helpful in my conditions? Or should I consider something else? So getting these foundational principles well settled in your mind will help you to navigate wherever you need to go with whatever you're working with and everything. So I honestly think, and I try not to do too many of these deviations, but because we'll never get through all the material. We never get through it anyway. But we get through what the Lord wants me to get through. Yeah, I'll wait on it. Sorry, I didn't get my thing out here. So there are different schools of thought in agriculture, and these are just general categories. These are not even the subcategories that pop up in and if somebody is practicing one of these schools of thought, I'm sure that there's going to be people that say, oh, you really didn't define that quite the way it should be defined and everything. But I've done my best to capture the essence of what the philosophy is in the process. But these are the main schools of thought that are out there, and I'm sure some of you have heard from one version or the other, and every single one of them has virtues to them. Every single one. But you remember what I said about what Satan likes to do with truth? He likes to include just enough to capture your attention. And he especially knows how to attract you to ones that are going to really wow you with the effect that they have on you. But all the while, something's lurking under the surface that's not very good, that it'll eventually come up to the surface, and you'll all of a sudden find yourself in a position of having problems as a result of it. So again, this is why I want to establish these fundamental principles. So you can take any one of these if you're considering it or looking at it. And I'm not here to trash or bash any school of thought. I'm here to simply give you the information to consider so that you can pick those things that will work. So the top one is conventional. This is the dominant school of thought in agriculture, and it's just selective chemistry. It's mediated by selective chemistry, NP and K. You put the things on that's going to produce the most crop. But you remember what I talked about what type of crop it produces? We're going to talk a little bit more in just a couple slides here. It produces calories. It produces volume. It doesn't produce nourishment. Now, yeah, I meant to start with this. I'll do it this afternoon. I spoke with an individual who's worked as a consultant up here in this area. He lives in Presque Isle for 30 years. And it was interesting what he shared with me. I wanted to ask some questions about the testing methods that the university uses and some of the stuff going on up here. Well, I'll share it when we start this afternoon, so I don't take the. Which one? Albrecht. That's the one we're gonna focus on. But the most widespread program and school of thought is the conventional one, where they're using targeted nutrients to produce high yields, but they're not producing nourishment. And I shouldn't say they're never producing nourishment, but they're producing watered down nourishment, watered down nutrition in order to do it and get those yields. But that is the dominant school of thought still today. Then you have organic, and everybody's heard of organic growing, right? We talked about this a little bit. What most consumers believe about organic growing is that they're getting clean, nutritious food, right? Is that what most of you think when you think about organic? You're getting clean, nutritious food. Well, the problem is that's not necessarily true, but it's a great marketing advantage. You know, if everybody thinks that, you know, you have a marketing advantage, and that usually gives you the opportunity to sell at a higher price and create demand and everything. I have at least 50% of the growers I work with are organic growers. Many of them are certified organic growers, and they do really well. But there are a whole lot of others. The whole idea of organic is what you don't do. It's not a proactive program. It's not a proactive system. It's what you don't do. I don't use this. I don't use that. Rather than, this is what I do to improve the condition of my soil so that I can produce the highest quality food for you. So if you're just one of those organic growers that are out there just not doing things, well, it also means you're not, there's things you actually should be doing that you're not doing either. You're just avoiding the things that you're not allowed to do on it. But it's a pretty significant school of thought. It's growing particularly in the West, in North America here. It's growing in its popularity every single year. You have a pretty significant growth in demand for the product. Another school of thought is the biodynamic school of thought. And I put on here, it's a holistic esoteric mediation. It deals with energies and it's hard for me to describe. But it's kind of this thing where you're trying to work with the natural energies of nature and balance the energies and bring in the energies and everything. And there is a truth to getting energy into your growing system. But again, like I said, you know, what are you doing to get the energy in that system? And what else is necessary in order for that energy to be utilized? And so it's a little bit the philosophy is a little bit strange to me, but there's a lot of people out there that have a strong belief in it. And again, I don't want to condemn or criticize people. It's one of those things that I don't feel comfortable with because there's just a lot of things that are simply not being addressed on it. Another school of thought is permaculture, which is I put on there natural ecosystem mediation. And another thing I could put on there as well, we want to hold on to what we still have. It's kind of one of the ideas they're involved in there, and trying to remember I talked about organic growth is what nature can do, the highest functioning level nature can achieve and maintain stability. Well, this is kind of part of what the permaculture idea is about, is to encourage a stable natural system at the highest level possible. But again, my goal is to raise the possibility. My goal is to bring to the maximum level that I can possibly bring that system to, with stability on it, and not just be content with, because if you look at natural systems, and I'll tell you that not everybody that's involved in these schools of thought, but almost every one of these schools of thought is underpinnings is evolution. So nature is advancing. Nature is forming, not reforming. It's forming. Have you ever heard of the formation theory? Not so prominent anymore, or maybe it's so prominent that nobody even really talks about it anymore. I don't know on it, but nature is not advancing. Either that or the Bible's lying. So I choose to believe the Bible and saying that the earth is waxing old like a garment and is groaning under the curse. And if you look at successions where systems are deteriorating, you'll move from a grassland, a prairie or grassland type of ecosystem, which is fairly high functioning. You move into a hardwood forest or a deciduous forest ecosystem, which has lost function. And so now you've moved into trees. Now all of these things in God created trees, right? And that the healthiest, best trees, whether it's in any of these successions I'm going to talk about, actually the best, healthiest tree grows in the healthiest, balanced soil. So it's not a matter of these things wouldn't grow. You're just moving into a place where they're the only thing that can really grow, because it has the capacity to function within the limited function of the soil system now. And so what's happening is the trees. What is the vast bulk of a tree made up of? Yeah, it's made up of wood, right? If you were to look at, especially an older tree, you look at it compared to leaf area as compared to the volume of wood in it. What those trees are doing is they're storing energy. They're storing energy, hoping for the day when maybe that energy can be utilized to do something more fruitful. That's what the nature is trying to hold on to life here and keep it as stable as it can, but it's going down. It's going downhill. The next succession is a coniferous forest, or pine, cedar, those type of things. And in that situation, you've gotten even worse. So if you were to, like, any of you guys burn firewood? Do you use the ash from your wood on your garden? So you would get very different results if you were burning hardwoods and as opposed to if you were burning softwoods. And what I mean by that, hardwoods have fairly high calcium levels in them. The softwoods, the pine, the cedar, and that has virtually no calcium in it. And this is where one of the successions of what's been lost is it. So, I always ask people, can I use ash on my garden? And I say, well, which wood did you burn? What kind of ash is it? Because that's going to tell me, what you're actually going to be applying to it. But that's an illustration of how that succession is deteriorating. And so again, you're moved into a types of trees that are still storing energy, building it up with the hope that the opportunity will return to. I kind of compare it to the elders in the church. Been around a long time, been, wrestling with this and dealing with all this stuff and everything like that. And that gray hair's holding on the knowledge and the experience, right? To hopefully pass it on someday. Unfortunately, a lot of that gray hair goes to its grave before it has the opportunity, and that's the same thing that happens to trees as well. But anyway, what we want is what God wants. We want to see nature as a created thing and as an ordered thing, and we want to understand, well, what's happening? Why is it groaning under the curse? Why is it deteriorating? And what can we do to restore it? Aren't we about restoration, reconciliation, reform? What is it that we can do to bring it back to the place that God intended it to be? Now, I always tell people there's two things that God's going to have to create new. Does anybody know what they are? The earth. What else? Us. He's going to have to give us new bodies, and he's going to have to create a new earth. Why? Because neither one of them is inherently in harmony with the will of God anymore. And we have to, what we want, I'd say soil is parent material just like you and I do. And what this soil wants to do is not necessarily what it needs to do, what it should do. Now, nature is not in rebellion against God. Nature is doing everything it can to preserve life. But we're in rebellion against God. And the problem is what we want to do is not in harmony with what God wants to do. And in fact, if God wasn't pursuing us, we wouldn't pursue him. And so we have to impart the right condition. I remember I had that slide that said, are we going to impose or impart? We have to impart the right character to the soil. We have to impart the right character has to be imparted to us. But in the reality, in the end, we've got to have a new body and we've got to have a new earth because they're broken. They're destroyed, if you want to put it that way. And nature's really actually doing everything it can to hold on to life. And it's going downhill really fast on it. Anyway, sorry about that side note, but I think it's relevant. So you have another school of thought called the biological school of thought, and it's microbe mediated. In other words, the microbes in the soil, the biology in the soil can fix everything. Now, if they're given, remember I talked about organic growth. The organisms in the soil and everything, all the soil dynamic will do everything it can to stabilize. I've said that. So it will definitely do whatever it can to preserve as high a function as it can. But can it actually take and restore the soil, bring it back to where it needs to be? Well, that depends a lot on what we do. Remember that the earth is in the condition of because of our dominion. The soil is what it is because of the consequences of the flood and what man has done to it. So there are things that we can stop doing that would allow nature to restore to a certain extent. So some of those things might be like just, excessive tillage of the soil where we're constantly disturbing everything. Now, it may be necessary, but there are just things that we're doing, spraying stuff, killing it all the time, not letting something grow on the soil. The microbes in the soil depend on the energy that comes from a growing plant. You can have it, if you look at the organic matter, hopefully we get that far. The organic matter in the soil is like a battery. It's a backup energy source that can be tapped into, but eventually what happens to a battery if you're running just off the battery? And so something that can be done is simply have something growing there instead of leaving it bare. And there's all kinds of ideas about, like I farmed in Colorado for a long time, and they grow dryland wheat there. And if you fly over Colorado, if you drive through there, you'll see these stripes of one section growing the wheat and one section kept cultivated, tilled and bare. And the idea is that, well, we've got to conserve moisture in here by not letting anything grow there, so that they alternate, and every other year they grow and try to accumulate moisture. Well, they're discovering now that actually having something growing on the soil conserves more moisture than keeping it bare. And I'll throw these two things out here because I always do this because thoughts come into my mind. I think I'm not going to remember this later, or I may not get to it. They did some research on this. You mentioned cover crops. in West Texas, they did some research on what the difference in soil temperature is with a crop with a cover on it, something growing on it, and the soil kept bare. And when they took the readings, the temperature readings, the air temperature was 105. What do you think that, some of you heard this, so don't answer if you heard it already, because it was an after the class discussion. What do you think the temperature under the cover crop, the soil temperature under the cover crop was? Air temperature was 105.
80?
Somebody said 80. Anybody else? No guesses? It was 74 degrees underneath that growing crop. Air temperature was 105, but it was 74 degrees. What do you think the temperature on the bare soil was? 100? Do I get a higher bid? I got 100, 110, 120. It's 150 degrees. Now, let me ask you a question. How would you feel trying to work in 150 degree temperatures? Well, that's exactly the way the microbes in the soil feel. They're in a siesta. They're not doing anything. And what else happens with that is you get moisture loss through evaporation with all of that. Because of the higher temperatures. Now, we've talked briefly about a little aspect of it, that this whole climate change thing and stuff, and people talk about the temperature increasing. Well, first of all, you know, if we were honest with the data that we have, historical data that we have and everything, there's fluctuations. What's actually happening, and I'd mentioned that CO2 actually follows temperature, it doesn't drive it, and it's a feedback in nature which we're about to destroy that actually will bring the temperature back into more reasonable range. How it does that is it just increased CO2. Commercial greenhouses, we're at about 350, 400 parts per million ambient CO2 in the atmosphere. At 250, things start dying. Commercial greenhouses inject and increase the CO2 levels in the atmosphere to 1,000 to 1,200 parts per million, and they get much better growth. And so the reason that CO2 increases is because it increases vegetative growth, and vegetative growth attracts moisture. And moisture, as what does water do with heat? It absorbs it, right? And then it gives it back off during cooler temperatures, so it stabilizes temperature. So it's a feedback to try to bring stability again to the temperature. But we're talking about drilling down into the earth and getting rid of it. What they're really talking about is getting rid of you and I. That's what they're really talking about, is getting rid of us. But Satan does nothing but destroy. And
Climate control is not so much about the climate as it is about control.
Say it again.
Climate control is not so much about the climate as it is about control
yes.
and
So-
giving the earth a day of rest. You can figure out what day that
Might be, yeah. Well, that's another thing. What does the Bible say about the fact that the nation of Israel didn't give the land its rest? God gave it its rest, didn't He? On it. So again, these are these things that man could do to allow nature. And the bottom line is that the model that I used, we'll get there. I'll talk about it when I get there. I'm there now. Okay, so the model that I use is called the Albrecht CEC model. And we're going to talk about CEC, but it's based on complete and balanced chemistry. And complete and balanced chemistry addresses physics, which is the structure of the soil. You have the balanced mineralization, you have the porosity. Remember the pie chart that was up there? You establish the porosity, and you allow for air exchange, and you allow for water holding ability, and what's called capillarity, which is the ability of water to move in the soil. So what if you have plant roots in the soil here, pulling the water from this part of the soil? You want water to be able to move. So if there's more water over here that's not being tapped into, it'll actually move towards where the water is being taken. You want that to be able to happen, and that's a soil structure thing. It's a porosity thing on it. And then once you have the house and you have all the resources, the microbes in the soil, the biology in the soil will kick in and do unbelievable things that we don't have the capacity to do. Remember I was talking about nitrogen as that free source there, and the Haber-Bosch, I never talked about it, the Haber-Bosch process where they use tremendous amounts of energy to produce fixed nitrogen. Well, the microbes in the soil know how to do it way more efficiently. You know, they can do it with way less energy. And you know, we don't even know how they do it. Isn't that something? We don't even know how they do it. Our process is way more energy intensive and inefficient. And I make that illustration because there's a thousand other things, thousands of other things that the natural system can do for us. Why would you want to spend the time doing it yourself if the natural system can do it for you and it can do it more efficiently and more effectively than you can? Our job was to steward. It wasn't to control. It was to steward the land, to steward what we were made of, which is the dust. That's what we were supposed to do. And so this whole model, that's what it's designed to do, is to restore a healthy, complete, and balanced soil, and then allow nature to do what it knows how to do. Now, there still has to be inputs in this situation, but as you build this system, the inputs become less and less. For example, trace minerals, once you build trace minerals to the level they need to be at, you may not touch them again for 40 years because so little is used. Now, the reason you even have to touch anything, if we had a completely closed system like the garden was, we wouldn't have to put anything on. We just dress and keep it. You know, Adam didn't have to till the soil until he left. But if we had a closed system, which nobody I know of does, where everything is going back that came out, you wouldn't have to add anything to it. But when I talk to market growers a lot, and they're putting heavy demands on their soil. A lot of minerals are leaving the farm. And so you got to put them back. You got to give back. If you're going to receive, give back on it. And as long as we're operating our systems that way, but the reality is, well, let me talk about this last one, and then I'll talk about that. The most recent school of thought is the regenerative school of thought. And it is also microbial mediated. It's talking about some of these things that we're doing that are actually destructive, that we need to stop doing, and we need to start doing other practices that are encouraging the biological life in the soil. But the downside to this approach is, remember I just said, we're not in closed systems anymore. No, we're not putting everything back. This system is designed to use biology to mine the soil, which it can do fairly well. To mine the soil, and it might be able to mine it for 100 years. But what about year 101? Now we think, well, I'm not going to be around, so who cares? That's kind of the attitude you hear all the time. I'm not really going to be here, so it doesn't matter to me. Somebody else will figure out what to do then and everything. But is that the way we should steward the ground? Now I tell people, I've told somebody, well, you can impose yourself, you can exploit the soil for a little while. If I know what the conditions are and anything, if you can't afford to do anything, you can impose yourself on it for a little while. But you better be careful if you get, too comfortable in that habit, and you're not giving back to that soil, because eventually they'll come back and bite you. And so I'm also concerned about this school of thought because all the major food corporations and a bunch of big corporations have got behind us and are really promoting it. Now that triggers suspicion in my mind right off the bat, because they're not really that interested in stewardship.
Does that background picture have any meaning?
That's my farm.
So what's the tower-like thing?
Over here?
Yeah.
That's a tree. Yeah, and we have kestrels that nest in that tree every year.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a small, what's the family of birds? They're like falcons, hawks. They're in the same family, but they're little. They're just like this big. They're the cutest things you ever see. And we didn't know we had them, and we found one, a fledgling, down by. There's another building right here, down underneath there, and we weren't sure if it was injured or what. We didn't know there was a kestrel. There was kestrels nesting there, and they require a big territory. So, but we called the rehab people to see if we needed to bring it to them and everything, and they said they came out because they're dying off, and so they came out right away and picked it up, and they took it. It wasn't really injured. It just needed some nurturing and everything, and they nurtured it back, and they actually brought it back out to our property. So we want to release this right where it was. And so every year we have fledgling kestrels crawling around in this barn or up around here when they're not quite flying yet, but we understand now. Just leave them alone, and they'll get it figured out. We usually get two or three of them a year, and we're not sure where they all go because they have big territories, so they can't just stay right there. They're going to have to go off and find their others. But anyway, so the thing about the Albrecht model that I use is it's a stewarding model. It's cooperating with nature in every aspect, in the chemistry aspect, in the physics aspect, in the biological aspect, and encouraging. And that's what Dr. Albrecht did. I remember, some of you may not have been here, I was saying that he said, study nature, not books. And he said and he wasn't against studying books. What he was meaning was, if nature disagreed with what the book said, if what you observed was different than what the books were claiming should be, then listen to what nature has to say, and then pursue discovery of understanding what's actually happening and why and everything. And this whole model was developed by going to nature and understanding how it actually works, and then establishing, the soil back in a place. And he spent decades, him and several other collaborators spent decades, 100 years ago, and you probably won't hear about this after you leave here from anybody else, because this whole model, it is not in a textbook anywhere. I think I don't can't remember, it was during class or it was after class, we were talking about that with his experience at the University of Missouri. He was a soil microbiologist. He was forced into retirement because the Green Revolution was happening, and he was opposed to what was coming down the road. And I'll just tell it real quick because there were a lot of you weren't here. He gave a presentation before the whole staff of the university and everything, talking about the possibilities and saying that if we'll just implement what we know, then we won't have to be treating all these animals for diseases anymore, and we won't have to be treating people for all these diseases anymore. We can eliminate them. Well, the head of the animal science department was in the audience, and he heard, eliminate these diseases. And what do you think he heard? My job is in jeopardy. And from that day forward, this whole thing was opposed. And I could tell more about it and everything, but it's a remnant of the population that actually pursues this. And the ones that pursue it, I was telling somebody this morning, and we'll get to it, hopefully. How much time we have here? About 10 minutes? We're going to talk about diseases and insects and everything. I'm sure none of you guys have problems with any of that stuff, right? Or weed pressure. There is a law of cause and effect. If there is an effect, there is a cause for it. And if you can understand what the cause is and you can correct the cause, you can correct the effect. You can change the effect. If you continue to do the same thing over and over and over again, and you keep having the same result, well, we all know that that's insanity. But that's what people do over and over. When I start this afternoon's class, I'll talk about what this guy told me about the area here and farming in the area here, which was pretty interesting. So that's the school of thought that I follow. There is virtue to some extent in every other one of them. And again, I don't criticize or judge anybody where they are. I just try to encourage them to say, okay, what is the fundamental requirement here, and how do I achieve that? And one of the illustrations between these two, the microbes in the soil can structure soil too. Chemistry can do it much better and is much more durable. Say the biology in the soils, through the glues that are produced and things like that, starts aggregating and structuring the soil. which it can very effectively do. But you have to go and till that soil. What happens? You just destroyed a lot of it. Is the chemistry still there? It's still there. And so you don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. So let's get along here. All right, turn this on. Well, that's working. So these are the principles that you need to keep in mind when you're trying to work with your soil. The first one is complete and balanced chemistry, which I just talked about. You need now the regenerative school of thought developed these, and I'm going to talk about one I don't have on here. But they don't include complete and balanced chemistry. I am considered a heretic for putting that up there as a soil health principle. But I think it is the most fundamental principle, is the dust of the earth and how it's ordered. And we address that. The second principle is you want living roots in the ground as much time as possible. You want something alive growing on that soil. Why? Do you remember what I just said a little bit ago? The microbes, well, yeah, moisture and everything, but microbes in the soil get their food from the energy produced by plants. And if it's in the battery from something that was grown before and is still stored in the battery there, they can utilize the battery until the battery runs dead. But they depend on energy from plants. And plants give away up to 75%. On average, it's 50% of all of the energy they capture and store. They give it away. They dump it into the soil. You remember that picture I showed? Oh, you weren't all there. We'll see another picture of the same thing. It was a microscopic picture of a plant root with the root hairs and all these big bubbles of liquid sugar being oozed out into the soil. And believe it or not, plants can produce thousands of different iterations of these energy compounds and signaling compounds that they send with them. And each one says, this is the condition, this is what I need, where are the organisms that can help me with this? They're putting the food source for them and the request out there, and they come to help if we're not doing something to kill them on that. And the plants actually produce, in different types of plants produce different ones, well, I have it there, so we'll wait on that to get there. But you want to keep something alive on that soil as much as possible. If you fly over the United States, depending on what time of the year it is, you're going to see a lot of farmland with corn and soybeans, wheat, stuff like that growing. But more than 50% of the year, you're going to see bare ground. You're going to see nothing growing. Now, a lot of growers have moved to a no-till situation where they're leaving the residue on the surface. Again, that's another one of the principles we're going to get to. So that's a little bit better than at least it just being plowed and totally bare and nothing going there. There's multiple problems with that. But the vast majority of the year, nothing's growing. And so what's happening? You're draining the battery. And so most soils don't have a very big battery anymore. We'll talk about that when we get to carbon fertility. The other principle there is to keep it covered. Well, what's the difference between keeping something living growing on the ground and keeping it covered? Well, you can put mulch down to cover the ground as opposed to a living crop. Hay, wood chips people have brought up with the back to Eden method, grass clippings, leaves. There's lots of organic materials, and some people are putting woven ground cover, just plastic ground cover down over it, which has its benefits, also has its drawbacks. So you're still keeping the ground covered. The problem with this methodology is if you don't have the structure in the soil, if you don't have the right chemistry and the right structure in the soil, it can actually cause problems for you. It can cause waterlogging of the soil, which will encourage fungal diseases. It'll encourage oomycetes, which are another, like Phytophthora, which is a water mold. You're going to encourage all these problems as a result of that because you're just cutting off adequate air exchange in the soil. And so that's why I start with the chemistry, because if you start with that, then all of these other things contribute to the improvement of the soil. Sometimes they make it worse in the process of trying to make it better. But I had mentioned earlier that God doesn't reject us simply because we don't listen to him. His pursuit is relentless for us. And so I have growers that will insist, I'm going to use these materials because they're the cheapest ones. And they're not chemically stable, like anhydrous ammonia, which has a pH of 12, or triple superphosphate, which has a pH of 3. Highly soluble nutrients. All of these things, nature is going to say, this is not stability, and it's going to immediately go after stabilizing it. It's going to kill a lot of stuff in the process. But if you know how to intelligently address it, have them apply it in order to go the right direction, and you can help them to see improvement, eventually they get to, they'll listen to what you have to say. And God works with us that way all the time. You know, we insist on doing it this way, and God says, okay, let's do it like this. If you're going to do it that way, let's do it like this. Did God want it that way? You need to understand the difference between God's permissive will and his active will. You know, the Bible is full of his permissive will. And we consider it his active will, and it's not. It's just God condescending down to reach us where we are in a way that we can comprehend and hopefully appreciate. And he can move us to another place. He can move us to a better place. So keeping it covered, and we talked about what the difference of keeping it covered is. Better, generally you have better moisture preservation, you generally have better temperatures. It gives more opportunity for microbes in the soil to actually function. And it also helps to reduce erosion from wind, water, those type of things, to keep what you have instead of losing it. Diversity is the next principle. There's research that was done. Let me see. We'll try to get through this real quick. We don't have that far. There was some research done by the Jena Institute in Germany, where they were looking at this to see how well soil improved over different regimens of putting cover crops on. And where they had the most diversity, the most different variety of plants growing, they had the quickest and the most effective development of the soil, as opposed to just a single crop. And the fascinating thing is, and I wanted to share this to help you understand, that nature is a giving system. It is a system that's connected and depends on each other to work, to cooperate. They were along a river there, and the whole thing flooded and was underwater for several days. And in their diversity plots, most of the plots, everything died. But in the most diverse plots where they had plants that were above the water still, when the water receded, the plants that were under the water for several days were still alive. And they discovered that the reason they were still alive is the plants that were above water were giving them oxygen. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, how this highway, this resource highway is established, how this communication network is established. And so it's fascinating to me. It's mind-boggling. I've been doing this for 32 years, and I feel like a little child that doesn't know anything. As we're starting to learn about the things that actually happen in nature that we just can't even hardly comprehend how intricate it is and how cooperative it is. But diversity. So you don't want to go out there and just plant corn on the same field year after year after year, or just. You want to try to plant them together, and I'll show some pictures of that. Try to plant crops together, as it works to do that. Now, I'm going to show some pictures of that a little bit. But
Yes, I've learned how to do companion planting.
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Plants that
That's
do good.
that's something that we've had the concept of for quite a while, but have had no idea how effective it can be if we actually implemented it in the ways that we can.
Corn, beans, and squash, the Native Americans planted together.
Yeah, so the Native Americans, he was just saying that the Native Americans planted corn, beans, and squash together. And it was a much more effective growing system as a result of that. Yeah.
My squash grew better when I did that.
Yes.
I didn't do it this year.
Yeah.
That last year.
That did better.
Right. There's a green cover seed. Okay. There's a company called Green Cover Seed, and I strongly encourage you to go to their website. They're a Christian company, and they're fantastic with the cover cropping stuff and helping people to put together, a program for implementing cover crops and green manures into their Green Cover Seed. Green Cover Seed. They're in Nebraska. Seed, like in the seed you plant.
Yeah.
Yes, just search Green Cover Seed because I can't remember if it's greencover.com or if it's greencoverseed.com, so I don't remember which one it is. Okay, we need to just do the last one because we're a little bit over right now and be done with this. Know your context. Somebody in here is from Arizona. You're from Arizona, right? You live in a dry climate, right? That can get hot. How much rainfall do you get? Not very much rainfall. How much rainfall is anybody in here from here? There's some people from around this area. It's cooler here, right? Overall, year round, it's cooler. How much rainfall do you get? 3, 4 feet, 5 feet, I don't know. Okay. How you have to manage your soil is going to depend on where you are because it's going to have impacts. And I'll try to pick up on that when we come back this afternoon. Is going to impact how your soil system, your growing system. Heat, like I pointed out, how hot soil can get when it's bare. Heat's going to affect how well the soil is functioning, particularly the plant and the microbes in the soil functioning. Moisture levels can affect that. And so in Arizona, you have a net evaporative. I grew in Colorado, and you have a net evaporative environment there. So you're losing moisture, especially if the ground is bare. So you have problems with, like I work with Holbrook Indian School in Arizona, and they had the same environment. So they have a problem. Water wants to come up and evaporate. What's it leave behind when it does? It leaves minerals behind, salts. So you can get salt accumulate. We're going to talk about EC and EH and pH just briefly. We're not going to really get into the weeds with the science and everything, but they have groundwater that's really salty. And so they have these issues to contend with, which are, most of your water up here is you probably don't have to irrigate a whole lot, if at all. It depends on how consistent your rain is. And so moisture is a totally different issue with you. Evaporation probably doesn't really occur very much up here, so you're not bringing salts to the surface and everything. So the conditions you're working with here, and we could talk about I work all over North America and other parts of the world. And I can tell you that there's very different conditions, and we have to approach them. You have to address those conditions in order to do well with them. Because what affects one place, this is why you don't compare yourselves among yourselves.
Well, not only that, it changes from year to year. We've had years here where you feel like you're in a drought. Oh, yeah. And your crops are literally, when are you going to irrigate me again?
Right.
And then you have years where you're contending with everything is saturated. Like last year. Yeah. Oh,
right. And we're going to talk about that. We're talking about the environmental influences, and it's not just limited to weather. There's other things that can affect you, but we'll pick it up this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for participating. If I could stay for a few minutes, we were late starting the afternoon class yesterday because I stayed too long answering questions yesterday, and then we had a really long line to try to get